Okay, welcome to the Russian realm, the last part of Module 4. Again, this is a brief discussion of Russia in the context of the greater European issues today. I want to begin with the idea of the challenges of the Ukraine today. If you've been paying attention to the news and the media, especially the print media, one of the things that's beginning to happen right now is the movement of American heavy equipment into Eastern Europe as part of NATO. And in large part, this is a response to the continuing conflict in Ukraine. Now, if you look at this map, one of the very important things that you'll notice is that the Ukraine represents the transition between Russia proper today, and the historical Soviet Union. If you look at this map, what we're seeing here is the percent of the population which is Russian speaking, and that is native Russians, and the Ukrainian boundary. And so what I want to note is that if you think about it, so here is the boundary of Ukraine, at least politically, but the reality is nationalistically about here is the area where Ukraine begins to split between ethnically Ukrainian, or at least linguistically Ukrainian, and linguistically and ethnically Russian. And what we will see is that this is a challenge for both Russia and for Ukraine, and to a large degree, the rest of Europe. Now, why does the Ukraine matter? Well, ultimately, the Ukraine is a transshipment state, that is, an area where gas, natural gas primarily, from Russia is transshipped through Ukrainian pipelines into Western Europe. In fact, the Ukraine is the transshipment for the majority of natural gas going into all of Western and, in fact, most of Eastern Europe. And you can see it's kind of a hub to all of the gas pipelines moving through it. Now, as a result, Ukraine is very important in terms of Russia's ability to sell its natural gas to Europe. That represents a challenge. And as you read through the history of the timeline, you will see this challenge. Now, more broadly, when we talk about the Russian domain, what we're really talking about is the Russian state today, and then its persisting influence in the Eastern European states that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. From the standpoint of landmass, Russia is immense, the largest country in the world in terms of land area, and essentially occupies the northern half of Eurasia. The realm that we're going to talk about really includes the state of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, and Armenia. What we have to also understand is that since 1989, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, this is an area that has gone through immense political, economic, and in fact population change. And Russia remains an incredibly powerful influence in the area, although in fact its influence is what produces much of the tension. I just want to look at these types of maps to give you a context. Now, this is not latitudinally correct, it is simply area correct. All of Russia, virtually, with the exception of the Georgian state, lies north of the United States. But to give you a context in terms of its land area, this is how big Russia is. It's an immense landscape. If we now look at it in terms of what it really looks like, some important characteristics come out. So, first of all, when we look at the land area, what we'll notice is that if we take the far southern portion of the realm, it is essentially right here, and if we kind of follow latitudinally, that brings us to about midway through the Italian state. It extends well north into the Arctic, and we really can conceive of the Russian realm in terms of three areas. We have European Russia, and here are the Urals, as I mentioned last time, dividing the area. And then we have the greater interior of Siberia, all of this. And then we have this area, the Kamchatka Peninsula, and the Pacific coastal areas of Russia, which represent a very different and Asiatic aspect of Russia. When we kind of consider it in terms of its productivity, what we really have to understand are these very limited agricultural regions. And so for the Russian realm, essentially agriculture can only go on in this area and to any great degree in this area. Now, the balance of Russia then is forest, and up here is tundra. And again, that's an area essentially of permafrost. So Russia, while it's an immense landscape, actually occupies a relatively small area in terms of its arable land. And not arable in terms of moisture, but arable in terms of climate. What we do see, however, is that in eastern Russia, we see again this the forest cover, but in the far west we in fact have a fairly robust agricultural production area, primarily for wheat production. Now as you go into what used to be Soviet Georgia, today the state of Georgia, what you'll also see are some of the productivity that you associate with Mediterranean. So in terms of grape and wine production, not quite into the citrus and olive production, but Georgia is considerably more diverse in terms of its agricultural production. This became kind of an odd aspect of the Russian realm's landscape in terms of the Sochi Games in Russia in 2014. Because of all the places in Russia to put the Winter Games, Sochi is probably the warmest. And so it became kind of an ironic aspect of the Games that they were placed in the only nearly subtropical region in the entire Russian realm. And that's where they hosted the Winter Games. Now today, Russia continues to face significant challenges in terms of its population. And these population issues are, again, what are pushing some of the interaction and tensions with the West. First of all, we think about its urban landscapes, and there are really two traditions of urban landscapes in the Russian realm. One is the historically deep landscapes of Western Russia associated with St. Petersburg and Moscow. Again, these are cities that have histories going back into the 15th and 14th centuries, and so they are very much like the complex landscapes of European historical cities. In contrast to that are the eastern and central planned cities of the Soviet era, cities that were essentially placed in areas purely for utilitarian purposes, and from an architectural standpoint, cultural standpoint, they have virtually nothing in common with the western portions of the state. We also need to understand in terms of Russia is the idea of migration. And what we have to accept with Russia and the Russian realm is that migration, both internal and external, became kind of a difficult thing to nail down. Because of the Soviet era, migration in fact was commanded by the state, and ethnic Russians were moved throughout the realm into Asiatic Russian regions, into areas of ethnic diversity, and in fact out of the region into areas such as Cuba, South America, and in some cases even into sub-Saharan Africa. And so Russian populations were moved, and in fact this was termed Russification. Now today what is beginning to happen is that from these holdings or these satellite states during the Soviet era, many of the ethnic Russians are coming home. And in fact this Russification, or these transition zones that we see in the Ukraine, are an example of this. The other aspect in terms of population that Russia is facing is its demographic crisis. And Russia right now is one of the states in the world where a significant decline in population is occurring, and total fertility rates are dropping well below replacement levels. So let's kind of look at this landscape. First thing that I want you to note, again, is that like the United States, there's a distinct break between dense populations and sparse populations. And if you look at this divide right here, what you notice is that very clearly the population concentrations in Russia are associated with agriculturally productive landscapes. And so the far west of Russia is fairly densely populated. The far east and the center of the country are very sparsely populated. And so population, while fairly large, is very much concentrated. What we can also see is that, and again, these are migration patterns, historical migration patterns, and current. And what you'll notice is in this map is the Russification outward movements, and then the return of the ethnic Russians back to the West. And so what Russia is seeing is an expanding concentration of return migrants, ethnic migrants, back to the West. And again, migration into this area is increasing population locally, but having very negative effects in other areas. So as you read through this section, please make sure you understand both that internal and international migration. Today, Russia faces a significant challenge in terms of its birth rates and, in fact, in terms of its death rates. Today, Russia's population is declining, and in fact, it is expected that that population will decline dramatically over the next 30 years. There are many reasons for this: economic, lack of opportunities, persistent challenges with political stability, and in general, the failure of the Russian state to, in a sense, make good on the hopes of people at the end of the Soviet era. What we also know is that in the area there are very distinct differences between the reproductive and the population dynamics of different ethnic groups. In the West, while these are areas of significant decline, the ethnic minorities in the East and in the Southeast are in fact experiencing some fairly substantial population growth. That doesn't mean that's necessarily good for Russia, because in these areas, as the growth occurs, there are also pressures towards separation. And as a result, in many respects, Russia has returned to a strategy of control and centralized control. Again, when you think about culture through the region as you read this, please make sure you understand the dominance of the Slavic populations, again, primarily in the West, and then the increasing diversity, cultural diversity, as you move eastward. We also have to understand Russia as an imperial state, and what we haven't really done yet is talk about that. But as you read the text, think about the difference between a political state, a modern political state coming into being, such as the United States or many of the countries in South America, and the imperial state. England is an example of this. Russia is an example of this, where the state that we see today is in fact a historical outgrowth of a long-standing empire. And what you typically see in these in imperial states is what we see right here, which is Russia as an expansion during its imperial period in forms of colonialism or simply expansion and holdings through military expansion. And as a result, each of these areas has a tension between the center empire and its margins and the occupation or conquest of these areas. And so in the West, in terms of Russia, there's a very strong national identity associated with St. Petersburg and Moscow. As you move farther and farther east or far west into the former satellite states, we see less of an association with Russian Empire and Russian nationalism. This can further be seen in the language map, and again, please pay attention to this one when you look at it. And what you'll see here very clearly is that the linguistic map of Russia shows the divisions and the strength of Imperial Russia and its declining importance or influence as you move west and then far to the east. The other important distinction that I do want to put kind of in your head regarding the Russian realm is in the West, the incredible importance of orthodoxy. The Russian Orthodox Church as a form of Christian religion is extremely important, and of course we see it in the iconic St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, these onion-domed cathedrals associated with the Orthodox Church. But what we also see in Russia is a diverse religious landscape, much more so than you see in North America. And what we see is the increasing influence of Islam in Eastern Europe, or in Eastern Russia rather, and certainly in Southern Russia. Now geopolitically, I just want to make an end point on this, is that the geopolitics of Russia today are the tensions between Russia reasserting itself as a global power and the challenges of the satellite states moving away from Russian influence. A couple of important points to make. If you look at Russia on this map, please note a key term, and that is an exclave. And Kaliningrad is the important exclave, and you'll see it right here. And what an exclave means is a piece of the sovereign state that exists outside of its boundaries. And what happened here is that as the Soviet Union collapsed, essentially, Russia needed to keep access to the Atlantic in an ice-free port. And what Kaliningrad essentially represents is the ability of the Russian Navy to have access to these areas. And so Kaliningrad was maintained largely as a seaport area for the military. The other point that I do want to make is the tensions of the Cold War. And if you look at all of the states that were part of the Soviet Union and then go back to the European map dealing with NATO, you'll understand that all of these Soviet states essentially represent tension zones and buffers between today NATO and its expansion and Russia and its desire to reassert its power in these areas. Please also note the ideas of Glasnost and Perestroika, the ideas of transparency in the free press that essentially at least contributed to the downfall of the Soviet Union. Today, those issues of Glasnost and Perestroika are really being seen in terms of the challenges of Russia's leader, Vladimir Putin. What appears to be happening, and as you read this, think about some of the Russian challenges to civil liberties, the questions of, for example, gender rights and freedom of speech within the area, and how these challenges within Russia are playing, Putin to a large degree is playing these for national identity support, and yet from the West and from the satellite states, this nationalistic identity is to some degree pulling them apart. This became very apparent in the Sochi Olympics, the tension between these two ideas, civil liberties and the goals following the fall of the Soviet Union, and the emerging desires of Russian nationalism to regain its power. Again, what I want you to think about in closing then is how Russia's extractive industries, its economies, link it to Western Europe, but that its geopolitical aspirations produce conflict. And along these pipelines between Europe and Russia, we will see these geopolitical tensions. So that's it for Module 4. We'll pick up again in Module 5.